is the science or practice of using constructed communication systems for the transmission or reproduction of information. In this article, they're primarily talking about the wire-based press. These are also referred to as discourse networks within the article. I'll come back to that quote, but then we also have yellow journalism.
Strenuously though, because that's largely jargon. I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Okay. And then yellow journalism, as we discussed, it's just journalism that's based upon sensationalism and crude exaggeration. The Spanish-American War happened in 1898. It was an armed conflict between Spain and the United States.
Okay, you can stop right there. We don't need to summarize the Spanish-American War. Obviously, this is a class in media. If this were a class in war, then we'd want to know more about that. I mean, the details are there for when you look at the article. What we're concerned about is the relevance to the study of media and politics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me move down. There were two main points in this article that I focused in on, primarily two different newspapers that were referenced. The first one being William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. And just a quick summary of what I thought was most important about that in terms of yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst dispatched Richard Harding Davis and Frederick Remington, two journalists / artists / illustrators, to report and illustrate the conflict between Cuban rebels and Spanish authorities. And I thought this quote was important. It says, "Shortly after arriving in Cuba, Remington grew bored by the lack of action and sent a telegram to Hearst. He said, 'Everything is quiet. There is no trouble. There will be no war. I wish to return.' And Hearst infamously replied, 'Please remain. You'll furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war.'" And this goes back to the aesthetic fallacy, which is defined in the article as a condition in which facts and details are used to construct a beautiful story or a story that distorts or supplants empirical truths. And this was originally stated as a praise for this new form of journalism that we now call yellow journalism, rather than a critique of yellow journalism, which the fact that it was praised also led to its rise. And this new form of journalism was not content merely to print a daily record of history, but also seeks to take part in events as an active and sometimes decisive agent. So I found a motif of this article, at least pertaining to yellow journalism specifically, is that yellow journalism has not only changed the way that papers are written, but also has changed history itself by either requiring journalists to sensationalize news that already exists or actually participate and influence history in a more newsworthy way, And then the second point, or I guess newspaper that I wanted to touch on as well.
Okay, sorry, I got to intervene. I was hoping I could signal you down without talking.
Oh, sorry, I'm on a different page.
Let's let Nolan take a little bit of this as well. I don't think you're going to leave him much to do. That's my concern.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. No, that's very good. First of all, does anybody have any questions so far? There are a couple of things I would probably take issue with, but it doesn't mean they're wrong. It means I might interpret them differently. But are there any questions or need for clarification, or can we keep moving? I don't want to rush these things too much. Okay, then Nolan, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, fire away.
So, I mean, she's on track with what I had to say. I mean, this article seeks to shed light on how telegraphy and wire-based press allowed for their manipulation of data through, the signals. And because of the word.
Hold on. What does that mean? Manipulation through the signals. What does that mean?
So manipulation of data through electrical signals.
That's telegraphy. That's all that is.
Correct.
That has nothing to do with journalism. In itself, nothing to do with journalism.
Okay.
Just on it, you know what I'm saying? In other words, that's a technological point. That's often misread in this article, that people think that the use of telegraphy in journalism is this idea of manipulating and encoding data. That's not what the author's trying to say. It's just that, unfortunately, he's not a very good writer.
Yeah, I definitely misunderstood that then.
Yeah, okay. No, in other words, a little bit about telegraphy. It is, by definition, encoded. You aren't actually sending real words. You're sending a code. Morse code is dots and dashes. All right. It used to be back in the day when we wanted to do college radio and stuff like that, right? Even though I wasn't in college, you had to get a certain license. And in order to do that, you had to learn Morse code and be able to transmit and read, even though no one was using it. That was part of getting the license. Okay. It's like, you know, in other words, it's like using a code, a language, a computer language or something. It has nothing to do with the actual content. It's just a way of encoding data of any kind. What we're more interested in, Nolan, is how did the use of telegraphy affect journalism?
How did the use of telegraphy affect journalism?
Yeah, that's the
Well,
whole point.
Yeah. So I mean, I was going to touch on how the journal sent down a couple guys to Cuba, and you know, that story about how, you know, he said,
Yeah, but we already know that.
furnish the pictures, and basically, I was going to touch on how the expense of transmission and how, you know, the war itself took place, you know, off continent, between expense and geography.
Okay, there again, that in itself has nothing to do with telegraphy. That's the way war was covered at that time. Remember, most of that expense was in things like renting boats and, you know, doing things like that. It wasn't telegraphy.
Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, basically my argument was, you know, between the rivalry of the newspapers and, I mean, geographic complications and the actual cost of sending the messages, um, you know, it pushed papers to rely on the yellow journalism, and you know, with the two newspapers seeking market dominance, how that drove them.
Okay, yellow journalism was not a way around that. In other words, the cost of covering a war did not compel people to use yellow journalism. That's technically not accurate. What we're looking for is the idea that the notion of yellow journalism, it isn't that it's fake news. I think a lot of you still misunderstand what yellow journalism was. Some of it was very sensationalist. We talked about a little bit of this, but if you look at the article, one of the few things the author seems to kind of get right, it's a new kind of journalism, and it's a journalism that's very action and presence oriented. It's about timeliness and immediacy and the energy of events, in which the journalist now actually becomes engaged as a participant, if not even a catalyst. William Randolph Hearst probably never said that thing about "I'll give you your war." That's probably not true. Okay, we have really no reliable evidence that he ever said that. The idea of that is, look, we're going to go down there and find the news wherever it is. So that's an important component of this. Remember that yellow journalism bleeds over into what was called muckraking. That isn't just about sensationalism. It's about sensationalizing authentic corruption and genuine scandal. Okay, but the use of telegraphy here becomes important because it imbues the coverage with that immediacy and energy that it didn't have before. Yes, it's expensive. Nolan was right. It kind of realigns the way that we think about now how we're going to invest journalist resources, right? But it wasn't that telegraphy pushed people into yellow journalism already existed. It had existed since at least the middle of the century. Because remember that we were popularizing newspapers. We were reducing the cover price of a newspaper and compensating for that by raising money through ad revenue. That allowed newspapers to move their editorial coverage inside, so no one got pissed off too much, and then use the front page and the front section for just kind of exciting news that would compel people to want to read, that would convince advertisers to continue to invest by buying ads in the newspaper. Right? That had already been established long before the Spanish-American War. The difference is the immediacy that's injected into news coverage and the sense of journalistic activism. That's what the author's trying, however ineptly, to convey to us. Now, this one I will understand, it's not an easy read. The style is cumbersome and clunky. There's a lot of kind of discipline-specific vernacular that even people like me who have done media studies look at that and say, man, why didn't you just say it in English? So I understand this one's a little bit hard to grab. But are there other questions on that particular? Yeah, Brett.
I just was struggling with his what seemed like dogged obsession with discontinuities and breaking things apart. When, to me, telegraphy eliminated a lot of those, like that discontinuous nature of the news. Like it allowed it to be transmitted in such a more efficient way that you could get more news to more places more quickly. And so I just didn't, he kept harping on that point of, breaking from physical travel and discontinuities of time. And I just never fully got that, I don't think.
Okay. Do either of our presenters want to respond to that? I would argue that he's trying to make a different point, but that it's not clear in the article.
I can't speak intelligibly to that point.
Okay. It's a subtle one, and it is a frustrating one. Monica, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I don't think I picked up on that enough to speak to it.
I don't blame you. Brett and all of you, what he was trying to talk about there was the way that media scholarship was carried out in analyzing these things as data. He was trying to argue that scholars studying journalism in this period of time and studying things like journalistic coverage of the Spanish-American War were isolating on sort of individual things rather than seeing them more holistically as an immediate narrative. He's just not saying it very well. Okay, so that's as much a critique of the scholarship on this as it is about what was actually going on in journalism. I can understand, though, that distinction is not clear. I'm looking for a replacement for this article. It's just that I'm trying to find something that is, academically rigorous, which, however imperfectly this is, that introduces the obvious effect of a technology on activating journalism and transforming it. Here's the takeaway from this is, from this period of time onward, journalism is different and it never really changes back. That is, it becomes much more about the journalist intervening in the moment. We'll see later on when we look at, for example, the use of radio in the coverage of the Second World War, Edward R. Murrow and the people that he was working with. All right. There is a sense there of the journalist being deeply embedded in the action as it occurs. You will hear, if you've ever heard any of the archival, broadcasts from Murrow and the so-called Murrow boys, you'll hear bombs blowing up and stuff. He's broadcasting during the Blitz in a couple of them. And the idea there is the journalist, the expression used to be, you are there, right? So that sense of immediacy and action and dynamism in journalism is something that radio takes that a step further. Television, obviously, if you've grown up like I did, literally watching Vietnam on television, the idea was these reporters, many of them wearing combat gear, although forbidden to carry weapons, right? Were actually going out on patrol. If they could convince a platoon leader to take them out into the field, they'd go, okay? That's journalists going to find the news rather than waiting for the news to come to them and then report it. Is that distinction clear? Because that's actually what he's trying to get at in this article. And I know he didn't do it very well, but does that make sense? Okay. And I think both of you in different ways kind of touched on that in terms of the activist nature, the exciting nature of yellow journalism as it applies to things like the coverage of war. I mean, we have to really keep in mind here, absent that kind of coverage, most of America wouldn't really have known that there was anything like a war going on there. Wouldn't have known anything about it. Wouldn't have known about the explosion of the Maine. Much less that we deployed troops, that we were actually intervening in a war against Spain, and that this was going to set the tone for American imperialism for another century. Most of America would have been completely oblivious. Indeed, much of America remained completely oblivious to that. But that's the attempt here. Again, however imperfectly done. Anything else on that?
Yeah, I have one just to back up to your point regarding the how telegraphy influenced yellow journalism. There's a quote in here in which he says, even syntax of newspapers was beginning to register and reflect the telegraph's rhythm. And also that there was the newspapers carried into print a new sense of time criticality because of the the widespread use of telegraphy.
Right.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, it's unfortunately he doesn't really explain this. You know how sometimes you don't see it as much anymore because most of you never have read a newspaper. You get your news different ways. But one of the things you used to see was what was called a dateline, and you'd hear on radio because people were actually reading wire service on broadcasting it, and they'd say Dateline so and so. They'd give you a location. Well, sometimes in that Dateline there was actually a timestamp. Okay, what that meant was that was the exact time the exact time, Western bias, right? That was the registered time at which that report actually came across the wire. And so there was this idea of things coming across the wire, that sense of immediacy and the kind of capturing of time in that sense. So yes, that's actually a good scene. You see how that fits into that idea of journalism from this point onward becomes very much immediate, dynamic, and time conscious. Yeah, and the idea of yesterday's news, it's not just that; it's the news of an hour ago. Remember that we lived in a country at that time where a daily newspaper might have 5, 6 different editions in the course of a single day. This really is accelerated by wire services. Wire services began in the middle of the 19th century. Okay, the AP is formed right around the mid-19th century. Okay, by the time of the Spanish-American War, it's become normalized. It is now driving the way that journalism is covered. It covers news. That news is covered by journalists. I'm sorry. That's what that's the sort of subtext of it. Anything else? Okay. All right. Well, let's move on then. And Renee, as I say, unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, maybe you prefer that. You are flying solo. And remember what we're looking for here is there's a lot in that article. Okay. This is not necessarily, although it's an important component of it, it's not exclusively or disproportionately about this new sort of the Victorian, what used to be called the new woman. Okay. It is about how that the message or the existence of that new woman was promulgated through the use of media, and particularly magazines. Does that make sense? Okay, fire away.
All right. Hello, everyone. So my presentation was on Victorian women reading, writing, and reshaping the sexual culture of America. And so to introduce it, the article starts with kind of an overview of the book, The Scarlet Letter. And the Scarlet Letter is something that is placed on women to signify that they are impure, they've done something wrong, like cheated on their husbands, they're a prostitute, something like that. And this kind of woman, then a lot of them sort of banded together to create this group called the Free Lovers. And they eventually, through fighting, activism, they would eventually form a publication like a press that had several different newspapers, the most important of which, and the one that appears in the article the most times, is a newspaper called Lucifer. And these were especially important because women could write in to these newspapers, and they have this advice column like any of the ones you would see in newspapers a long time ago, but these were specifically for questions and answers about things that could not be spoken about in regular Victorian America or England. So it provided not only an outlet for these women, but also a resource, because things like sex, sexual health, loveless marriages, those were just things that were not talked about in regular society. And I wanted to read their one more thing that the Lucifer newspaper supported was women bearing their children out of wedlock. Just if you wanted to have a child, you could do that as a woman free of your own volition. And so one of the letter excerpts that I thought was the most powerful comes from a reader who's not named, who had a child of her own, and she didn't want a husband in the picture. And the quote is, "I do not argue my right to sexual freedom. I know it, I proclaim it, I take it in the face of the world. Stretch me on social racks, roast me on social gridirons, apply your social thumbscrews until every nerve quivers. Do your worst, you cannot fix the scarlet letter on my breast." And there are other letters like this where these newspapers emboldened these women to be their own person and then continue to write in. Another woman saying that the Lucifer newspaper helped her teach her daughter the right to own herself. So this was going beyond just women teaching themselves these things. This was going now intergenerationally of things that would be passed down to these women's children. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place right now. But yes, the most important, the core of this is that these newspapers opened up discussion. They opened up a way for women to learn about these taboo subjects, and an outlet for them to vent their frustrations, or just come to a place where they could feel accepted and heard.
Okay.
And that is the gist of it.
That's solid. That's quite solid. Questions or comments? This is an important one. This is, especially when you consider that this is the 19th century and we're talking about women. And most of the time we think then of women being chattel and being sort of totally owned by men and being, kind of victims of the patriarchy and stuff like that. What we're seeing here is a counter narrative to that, a kind of almost revolutionary insurgency of women with respect to identity, sexuality, and the things that empower them in a society that otherwise is dominated, not just by men, this is what's important, but dominated by a kind of sanctimonious religious order, religious regime, and things like that, all of which is calibrated to repress, the desires of women as human beings, okay? So
I have one.
sorry, who's that?
Quinn.
Oh, sorry, Quinn, go ahead.
So while reading this and taking notes on it, I found it very, very nice to see this view, because in history classes, there's this normal path you go on, American history and all that stuff. But this really I felt it in that stuff, and reading about it was I liked reading about because it uncovered an important time in history that doesn't really get talked about. And I was I wish I knew about this. This is a very interesting topic. And I got to see stories on this. And I just wanted to say that it was really cool to see that.
That's good. How many of you also have that experience of having this be a relatively unknown historical experience for you? Because I thought I really kind of struck gold with this one. I think this one is quite well written. I think it's powerfully written, and it's a fascinating narrative. And I relate it to, actually, of all people, my great-grandmother, who grew up on the Pendleton Reservation and was subject to all that, had to go to the Indian school there. They would cut their hair. They do all these kinds of things to sort of humiliate them publicly, obviously physically abuse them and all these other kinds of things. And in the meantime, she was aspiring to be this very singular, powerful woman. And so when I found this, the first person I thought of was my great-grandmother, who unfortunately I knew only very late in her life. But yeah, I think this is a narrative that's often ignored. Monica, do you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just for some historical context, the Scarlet Letter, I feel like it's talked about a lot. How common was that in history? Was that something that happened to most every single woman that fit the category of needing a Scarlet Letter, or was that something that was kind of on the more harsh end of the spectrum?
I don't know how honestly how common that was. Renee, do you want to speak to that?
I did actually look that up, the Scarlet Letter, and how often that was given to women, why it would be given to them. So what I found was that it was more often given to women that like people would pay attention to.
Right.
Like if you were just like on a woman of the night, then they would not like bother giving that to you. But if you were a woman of high standing or even just kind of upper middle class, and you did something like cheat on your husband or turn to more unsavory stuff in that time, then that's when they would give it to you. And often it would be by like a family member who would have gone to some higher authority, and then they stick it on you. And you
But
work
yeah, I
for it.
think in terms of what there was of a proletariat or working class or whatever, that was almost never done. It was primarily done with people in the affluent middle class. And it was part of that Victorian morality. We have to remember that the Victorian period is characterized by this kind of, however hypocritical, this hyper moral environment. You see it in Victorian England, where it's a pushback against the decadence of the aristocracy. In America, it's a pushback against the decadence of the emerging robber barons and the people who led into the Gilded Age and things like that. There was a sense of excess and unsavoriness that was compensated for with this hyper-religious, obviously very patriarchal notion of what good and bad conduct was. Does that make sense? Which also leads comfortably into our next article. Even though this moves us along in time a little bit, a lot of the same social forces are still struggling. Can we move on, or do we have any more questions or comments about this particular article, which I also enjoyed? Yeah, Brett.
I just thought it was interesting that in that setting of Victorian America with the hyper religious belief systems going on, that they chose to name that paper Lucifer, and that it was so widely accepted that it was named that, and people wrote affectionately of that name. It just seemed odd.
Again, it's an attempt in part, ironically, to push back on that. Renee, I'm sorry, I think I preempted you.
You're all good. I just wanted to say specifically on that, something I found interesting was that the name Lucifer, the reason they named that is in the Bible, that name means light bringer. And so it's illuminating these problems for these women. And even I didn't quite get to this in the presentation, but exposing upper class people who claim to be so high and mighty and that their morals were better than yours. Part of what the newspaper did would also be to expose their lives or shed light on a situation.
Yeah.
But I also did think that was acceptable and like not prosecuted.
That's a good point. That's excellent way of summarizing. Anything else on that? Yeah. All right. Let's see. Who wants to begin our discussion of temperance and the African American magazine? I'm sorry, Anglo-African magazine. Who wants to go? Was that Quinn? Is that you? Yeah. Go ahead.
So my presentation is on the Anglo-African American magazine. I have a lot here, but I'm gonna crunch it down. First, I am going to say like the definitions of temperance, which is the abstinence of alcoholic drink. And then Protestant, which is a member or follower of any of the Western Christian churches that are separate from the Roman Catholic Church and follow the principles of Reformation, including the Baptist, Presbyterian, and Lutheran churches. So anyways, Shelley Block's article is about temperance in an Anglo-African magazine. The article goes into detail about the magazine, how the magazine attempted to portray temperance in a distinctly Black way. In the article, Block cites two serialized books, one named Blake and a short story called The Two Offers. This article paints a compelling backdrop on how African Americans fit into the 19th century media landscape. So basically, Block cites a researcher named Robert Levine indicating the promotion of temperance could be taken as a surrendering to the Protestant capitalist norms of the white community a destructive abandoning of African traditions and values. With this, Levine argues that the appeal of temperance was to demonstrate that African Americans could be on the same level of productivity as whites in the marketplace back then. Temperance was a largely white and Protestant belief, and thought that if blacks were temperate, they could fit into white prominent society.
Okay, why don't you stop there? That's covering a lot of the article. So let's leave something for your colleague to do.
Okay.
But before we do, sorry, are there questions or points of clarification needed? Okay. All right then, Jared, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so like Quinn was saying, they targeted African Americans, yeah, so the temperance was the focus, and it mostly was to the more of the middle class from what I gathered. But if we go on to the two books that were highlighted by authors Danley and Harper. So Danley wrote about Blake, which was a male African American that was a slave. He escaped his plantation after his wife died, and then would try to organize a revolt, a revolution, an insurrection, I think they even mentioned in there. And so it really, what they tried to push in the magazine, what the writer tried to push for a political or, like some kind of persuasive, was what you could do, or at least what the skills that, African Americans possess that are just as good as the white man, with temperance. So it showed many occurrences where with temperance, he evaded capture. He, outwitted who they described like lawyers and businessmen. And so that first book really showed how temperance could help fight slavery. And they really showed at the end of it with a character named Tib, how his intemperance, really shows drastic choices, and, how, it can kind of undo a lot of what they were trying to do. And then the second book was kind of the other side of the spectrum. It was a female African-American that, it actually didn't say the race. Actually, I thought that was really unique how it put its stance where it kind of was unknown, but it emphasized not going with what the kind of the norm was with middle classes. Everybody wanted to achieve like that white middle class, materialism, happy family, rich and stuff. And it really emphasized that, when those intemperance families and stuff, especially when it's genetic, or passed down through generations of abuse, neglect. It showed that one person, though technically had everything, was unhappy, died alone. And then the other character that didn't focus on materials and was heavily pro-temperance, like the happiness she got from helping people and connecting with the community, and showed, the strength that could be done through temperance, and so I feel like that the magazine really targeted, the African Americans in hopes to, get them up, to that middle class, status, at least, visually. Yeah. Oh, was I muted? Oh no, I wasn't.
Sorry about that. I was writing a note, and when I do that, I shut off my microphone because that clatter is annoying. I apologize. With respect to the use of media, what medium are we using here?
A magazine.
Okay, and this is important because the emergence of magazines is different from newspapers. How are magazines? I understand the notion of a magazine is not something. It seems so archaic now to think about, print magazines. But what was the purpose of these magazines as opposed to, say, a newspaper?
Right, that's actually a good point. I actually didn't really fully absorb that actually for the time frame that it was in. But yeah, I guess a newspaper is a lot easier to catch on the fly. I guess it kind of reaches a more wide audience, as in a magazine I think is more specific and targeted to a specific audience. And so I thought I had written down somewhere that it really was targeting more of the middle class. Of
Yeah,
the
you mentioned that, and that's important.
Yeah, and also right below them, to kind of, because the idea that I was getting, or the feeling I was getting, was that the visual, or the presence of alcohol really does diminish someone's character in a sense. And so I think that they're really trying to separate those from the ones without temperance, and yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a great way to summarize that. The point here with respect to the use of media and the politics of this is that this is not a revolutionary movement, okay? This is a reform movement, and the distinction matters. A reform movement seeks to improve the existing system, usually in a very rational or moral and ethical way, okay? So you see a lot of appeals to Black Protestantism. The Black Protestant churches have always been, bedrock in African American history in the United States, because they very much like the use of magazines. This was it was a targeted way of framing the Christian message for an African American experience. The magazines replicate that, just as Jared suggested. They target that to a much more focused, what we would today refer to as a niched market or a niched readership. All right, this is the early use of niche media that we now see on the internet. Okay, and the idea was there's an emerging, however fitfully, there is an emerging Black middle class from the end of the 19th into the early 20th century. This is where Harlem emerges as a Black community as opposed to what it once had been. Okay, there are now parts of the country, Chicago, especially the south side of Chicago, is a very dynamic, energetic experience. It's an environment of new energy, new capital, the founding of Black businesses, new Black wealth, and things like that. Again, that we often ignore in our history. We don't realize that. I think most middle-class white Americans assume that the 19th and early 20th century with respect to African-American life was just simply across the board abject poverty. And that would never have spawned the kinds of initiatives that we see in things like, the Anglo-African magazine. These are signs of an emerging middle class that has disposable income and aspirations to a better life and some education and literacy and sophistication and things that we don't normally associate with abject poverty. But they're up against abject poverty. You see this repeated, a generation and more later in things like, I was thinking of Richard Wright's novel Native Son, where he's dealing with this cycle of grinding poverty and the violence that's deeply embedded in that. And yet, Native Son is not a revolutionary novel. It was often interpreted mistakenly as an anti-capitalist novel. The old notion of anarchists and Marxists that violence was intrinsic to capitalism. That's not what Richard Wright was talking about. In fact, some people have argued Richard Wright wasn't quite sure what he was talking about, except that it had to do with this inescapable realm of poverty and violence, okay? But Richard Wright represented the emerging Black intelligentsia, part of that affluent Black middle class. I think, there are plenty of people who you can look at who emerge, at this time or into the 50s and 60s, who are trying to speak on behalf of a new intelligentsia. And they're not necessarily revolutionary. These are largely reformists. So the initiative here is, let's use a medium like the one that has been successfully deployed by affluent whites. Let's found our own magazine. And there indeed were newspapers as well, okay? Let's build our own middle class because white America won't let us share theirs. All right, that's an important subtext in which both the messages and the media, the magazines emerged was, all right, then we'll build our own middle class. But in order to do that, we have to take control of our lives, and we can't do that if we surrender to violence and domestic abuse and substance abuse and all these things. That's what's going on. And I think the summaries in aggregate, I think, kind of captured that. But does that make sense? That's kind of what that's about. And so what I chose that partly because it really is an example of how people are using media to pursue social and political ends. social, economic, and political. In other words, they're trying to reform the system by improving themselves. Okay. Now we can look at that cynically and say, oh, they're just being co-opted by white America or whatever. That's easy to say looking from the outside. You know, it really is. But this was a titanic struggle for the liberation of sort of the hearts and minds of Black America. And white America wasn't doing a lot to help, you know. And so the idea was, then we'll build our own world. This is not Black nationalism. Okay. There were publications that emerged at this time, you know, the Back to Africa movement and things like that. That's more like Black nationalism. You know, the idea of, well, we'll just go and live in Liberia, or we'll go, you know, you think of Rastafarianism. That's a reactionary political movement. All right, it harkens back to Rastafari. That's Haile Selassie. Okay, it's Black Zionism. That's, you know, that's a nationalist movement. This was an American movement. You know, this was an idea of starting from a parallel middle class that ultimately many of these people believed would organically merge with white middle class to form a greater American middle class. The accumulation of wealth, the ownership of property, businesses, things like that. So you see how this is a reform movement rather than a more radical revolutionary movement? Does that make sense? Okay. And it is important that various insurgent movements in the United States have relied on the widespread literacy of the American people. I mean, something as current as QAnon, you know, it still requires literacy, even though a lot of what they post as videos, a lot of it that's the modern equivalent of a text. The difference is QAnon's message is revolutionary. You know, it really is. It's like if you read, later on, you know, we'll talk about like the Berkeley Barb and things like that. That was a revolutionary publication. That was not about reform. That was about crushing the system and building a new one, and, you know, on its ruins. Okay, that's not what this is. As long as we're clear on that. All right. All right. See, we're making good time here. We're making good time. All right.
I have a
Are we
quick
ready?
question.
I'm sorry. Yes, who?
You're good. Could we back up to the difference between magazine publications and newspaper publications?
Yep.
I had a thought, and I want to see if this is a valid conclusion to make, or if I'm thinking about it all wrong. To me, magazine publications seem more long form than newspaper publications. Like, magazine publications seem more like an episodic series that changes as it goes, whereas newspapers seem more like something like Tom and Jerry, that every time an article happens, it's kind of back where it started. Is that an accurate assessment to make?
I think more or less. Julian, did you have your hand up? Did you want to take a piece of that?
I was going to say, I can speak to that as someone who wrote about youth publications as a form of media. And one of the things that they mentioned in the essay was that there are 3 different types of publics that are constituted by, I think they were talking about media sources, but a newspaper is more, well, less targeted, like we said originally. And a magazine is kind of, since it has a more niche readership, it needs to constantly renew that readership's interest to maintain it. So I think that you're right in coming to that conclusion. And while a newspaper is targeted to a more general audience, and I think that.
Okay.
I lost my train of thought, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's really good. And that's an interesting way to summarize that. I would suggest in a more simplified way, perhaps oversimplified, think of newspapers as dedicated to the kind of breadth of coverage. Magazines are more interested in depth. That notion, Monica, as you mentioned, of long form. If you think about the difference between, say, the San Francisco Chronicle as a newspaper and Rolling Stone as a magazine, okay? Part of that notion of being niched is that we're gonna deal with like Hunter Thompson and people like that later in the term. It was very hard as he emerged or lost his discipline or whatever he did for Hunter Thompson to find publication and get stories in newspapers. He started there, all right? He built his voice in much more focused, niched deep coverage, long form, perhaps journalism, whatever it was, let's say writing. Okay, so that's what magazines allow for and indeed facilitate historically is, look, you don't have to worry about covering the waterfront here. Go really deep into this, because the people who will buy this magazine, which is more expensive than a newspaper, more lavishly produced than a newspaper, and runs much deeper into the substance. As you say, Monica, also very appropriate. Often will serialize. Yeah, very important. In other words, hey, you know, this is long form. Pick up the next part of this in next month's edition. Yeah, so I would think of it as the difference between a more populist breadth and a more focused, even sometimes elitist depth. Okay, I'm sorry, Renee, you had your hand up and I didn't see it.
It's all good. I was just gonna add on that perhaps in addition to like the depth versus breadth thing, don't newspapers have to be like, of course they can have a leaning like politically, but if something like that were to just be published in a regular newspaper, like the temperance, the stories that were talked about, wouldn't that be something that's not allowed? Because
Oh, no.
newspapers,
Oh,
yeah.
no. No, there's almost no oversight of what newspapers can publish in this country.
Oh.
Absolutely not. It's a perfectly fair question. Please don't misunderstand. In other words, there's no FCC or anything like that that's ever existed. Other than libel law, there's not a lot of things you can do. Plagiarism, obviously, but we're not talking about that. And indeed, many newspapers carried, and to this day carry, feature sections that look like magazines. They're published like magazines inside of newspapers. There used to be a thing, I don't even know if it still exists. It was a kind of very conservative mom and pop sort of Norman Rockwell thing called Parade Magazine. And it used to come out in the Sunday editions of a number of newspapers nationally, okay? So no, newspapers have really, the only limitation for a newspaper ultimately is timeliness. Magazines don't come out every day. So timeliness is not the issue. Therefore, depth compensates for timeliness. And so you're not wrong. It's just that it's not an actual limitation imposed legally or otherwise. It's just that people who get newspapers, the thing used to be, you got that newspaper at least once a day, every day. And you wanted to know what's happening right now. Think about our earlier coverage of yellow journalism and the immediacy and action-oriented nature of that, okay? You can't do that in a magazine. But what you can do in a magazine to replicate or create a simulacrum of that immediacy, you can use lavish illustrations. You can use photographs as that technology improves. And you can use, as Monica suggested, long form, complex, very well written kind of coverage of things, because that writer, instead of having to, I don't know how many of you have ever worked for a newspaper, but when I did, you know, you don't have days, you have hours at best to submit copy, okay? If you're writing, I mean, I remember when I started writing for magazines, you know, I realized, my God, I've got a week to write this thing. And all of a sudden it was 30,000 words. You know, that's what a magazine allows you to do. The only thing, Renee, that I would take issue with is the idea that there was some kind of, if you were implying that there was a legal impediment to that, to them doing it, and there isn't. So it's possible that I misunderstood you.
I wasn't quite meaning legal. I was meaning more that's the stories are something that are fictitious or kind of scenarios rather than actual like reporting things that happen. That's something that could only be printed in a magazine rather than a newspaper, because people might not read it that way.
I think you're right to the extent that it's not why people would buy newspapers. Okay, newspapers did sometimes serialize things that were fiction. Okay, it was done, but you're absolutely right. That was overwhelmingly the mass mediated province of niched magazine type publications. So I'm sorry, I misunderstood you a little bit there, and that's a good point. Yeah. I wanted to get your sense on this before we're making very, very good time. This particular article, did you find it readable? Did it make sense? Or
yeah, I did. Like, definitely reading through it. Sorry to interrupt, but
no,
like,
that's fine.
Definitely reading through it. As I said, like, I had a lot in my notes on like very what I thought important topics, but yeah, it was very readable. And it was like it made sense to. It wasn't just like, oh, you read this, is like, okay, I kind of get this. But reading it, you got it. It was
Okay.
definitely,
Okay. All right. Yeah, I quite like this one, but sometimes I'll get an article and it works for me, but students will read it. Like, for example, the last time I used this article, most of the students did not know what temperance was. And of course, notwithstanding that we're all alleged to have smart devices, no one's device was smart enough to tell them what temperance was. But other than that, it is, again, what I'm trying to give you here by studying media is a little bit of insight into periods of history and socio-cultural phenomena that have political implications that your rank and file history instructors might not have given you in high school and things like that. There are histories that, while they are not hidden, are obscured, okay, by the kind of monotony of education that we get in K through 12, and often the programmatic nature of that education. The idea that often in K through 12, the objective is really not so much to illuminate the world for you as it is to tell you how to think. And as a consequence of that, many of these historical narratives they somehow become truncated. They get left off. And I often think, perhaps idealistically, that if more Americans, and I would say not to be race conscious about it, but more white Americans and white middle class Americans were aware of these histories, okay, I think it would change the way that we look at movements and the way that we look at, and see the legitimacy in grievances that, privileged America might not otherwise understand. I don't mean to pontificate, but if there's an objective to this class, that's an important component of it. All right. I'm not interested in telling you how to think. It's just like, hey, before you make your conclusion, let me give you something else to think about that you might not have encountered. Yeah, Renee, sorry.
I know I've been talking a lot. Sorry if I'm bugging anyone with this, but in my article, it talks about how the women were kind of shoved aside, like this specific part of history is kind of shoved aside in favor for, votes for women and other movements like that. And I thought, like what you were saying, that's probably a big part of why I had never heard about this before, is because in history classes, they're so focused on like the big moments and then do like 60 pages on that, but you won't learn about things that might actually be interesting or that were important later. But in my article, it specifically says that happened to these women and to this newspaper as a part of history.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly accurate, and it's good principled scholarship, which is one of the many reasons why I enjoy that article. I also find it somewhat inspiring. I have to admit, it's very hard to inspire a cynical old fart like me, but I read that and I think, God damn it, sometimes there's something good that happens in this country, So anyway, that's that. Let me see. All right. We have two more to do. I think we're going to be able to get them both in too. How about that? So youth periodicals. Are we ready to do that? Sorry, I'm typing. I know that's annoying.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go first on that one.
Fire away.
My partner is okay with that. I'm going to talk about the Constitution of a Public, and a little bit about the schoolhouse flag movement and the sort of underlying motivation of the periodical, just to give them some idea of what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
Okay, so in the essay, Youth Periodicals, Patriotism and Textual Mechanics of Civic Mobilization, Philip Kirla examines the Youth's Companion periodical as a case study of how periodicals in the late 19th century were successful in constituting a public. And to us, I think a word like fan base or community might seem more familiar. And they did this through imagined camaraderie of their readership. The main goal of this from a marketing perspective is to maintain relevance in sales.
Okay, Julian, I'm sorry. Can I please ask you to do something? And
Yeah.
this would apply to all of you. I understand that many of you want to write these things out and refer to them and you end up reading them. Okay, I don't prefer that, but that's okay. Could you please, though, read more slowly? Because I'm seeing a lot of people who there's a thing that people do when they're not quite following, where they sort of lean forward. And I spontaneously saw that happen, where people want to hear what you have to say, but sometimes you're reading so quickly that you can lose your diction and the ideas get lost, okay?
Yeah, apologies. I'm trying to mitigate anxiety for myself by doing
I'm
this. I
saying
will.
one way to do that, take it slow. Give
Okay.
her a chance to breathe too.
Okay. So the paper examines Youth's Companion periodical, which was a magazine published in the late 1800s. So the 1890s is the time period we're kind of talking about here. And they did this through imagined camaraderie readership by creating patriotic projects for their readership to engage in. The companion's motivation, though, was also saturated with the desire to spread nativist and Anglo-exceptionalist rhetoric through pretense of renewing patriotism among American youth. So I think the most important takeaway from this essay is the success that media outlets have in cultivating social fraternity through affiliation and establishment of discourse and public opinion. And that happened then, and it was very, very successful in doing so. And it's still happening now if you think about the way that we receive our media and the way that we organize ourselves by identities. So the techniques employed in this campaign included mobilization of readers to participate in patriotic projects, namely the Schoolhouse Movement, which placed inherent value on flying the flag above public schools, claiming it would inspire aspirations of bravery and good citizenship in the children who attended those schools. And by participating, a student would identify themselves with desirable traits of youth citizenship. The periodical published statistics about how many schools had received their flag already to create a sense of belonging to a nationwide patriotic movement of youth committed to the same goal. The author also mentions the Pledge of Allegiance as a hook in the introduction, which I thought was interesting. And
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
Only because, again, we got to leave something for, I think it's Brett, isn't Brett? Aren't you doing that, Brett? We got to leave you something, man.
Okay.
But anyway, before we do that, this is good, solid coverage as far as it goes. Are there questions or points of clarification or anything, or are we okay? I mean, I think everything you said is wrong, but no, I think you did a great job. All right, Brett, are you ready? Have you stabilized the home environment there now, man?
Oh, we're home. We're finally home after 3 weeks of being in New York and sick, and it was terrible.
Oh,
but
man. Okay.
We're back home.
Do the best you can.
I'm mostly back to normal, but don't have to worry about getting COVID for a while anyway. So,
Oh, God.
so yes, youth periodicals, patriotism, and the textual mechanics of civic mobilization, which is, as you said, much more interesting than the title would belie. It seems like Carrie, who wrote the telegraphy article, wrote the title for this one, and then somebody else wrote the rest of it. So one of the things that Julian had kind of touched on earlier is the publics. And then, so there's like the three types of public: the public writ large, just as exists as a total body of a country or state or community. And then the concrete public, such as like the audience at a theater or a group of people bound by a common event, usually tied to physical space. And then the public, the textual public, which is what the Youth's Companion created with all of these patriotic movements and the Flag Project, which they were, by tracking the number of schools and the essay contests and all of these things that gave them physical interpretable data as far as their reach into the youth community of America, kind of did end up giving them that concrete audience that they knew in schoolhouses across the nation. They knew where their audience was, which was an interesting way for them to make an example of the successes of their campaigns. They could pretty much go to any schoolhouse and point at the flag flying above it and say, yep, we did that. And so our efforts here have been successful. One of the points in the early part of the article is scholarship analyzing youth periodicals at this point in the late 19th century is generally focused on the literary content and the contributors, What's less examined is how these magazines helped engage youth into the market, which obviously at the time was important, but through advertising and the types of advertisements that were put in the magazines. 500,000 households had subscriptions to Youth's Companion in the 1890s. So it was like a massively subscribed to periodical. And like, as we touched on earlier, it gave a lot of depth, and their focus were, you know, on the patriotic side of things, self-sacrifice, fraternity, in industry. And they really did. I don't know if anybody else kind of read some of the articles on the pages that were posted in the article that we read. They really did drill deep down into these issues that they wanted to use to civically mobilize the youth, which is just a fancy way of saying we have an idea of what we want the next generation to look like. And so we are going to push this agenda so that as they learn and come of age and advance through school, these are the ideas that they associate with being a good citizen, and these are the ways in which they are supposed to interact with the community. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have on the topic.
Sorry, I remember I'm typing. Are there comments or questions? Yeah, Renee.
Hi, it's me again. I was just curious, throughout both of yours, when you said it was mobilizing the youth and adding the flags and all of that, do you guys know, is this what made the Pledge of Allegiance said in schools? Like how we have to stand up every morning and like face the flag? Like, did that happen before this, or do you guys know?
May I take that one?
Yeah, this is, I think, where you left off.
It was, yeah, where I was going with what I was going to say. So the Pledge of Allegiance was actually penned by this dude as part of a Columbus Day initiative. He was like a Baptist preacher who was pushing his like nativist agenda. So I called him a dude. But he got the permission of the president and Congress, and he went around traveling and setting up these Columbus Day celebrations. And he wanted a ritual unification of the youth during the time when they would be raising their flag. And so he wrote this, and it has been modified since he wrote it, but it is why it was started being said in schools. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that's not, I mean, you know, the scope of every article has to be limited. One of the real challenges with respect to youth culture that isn't mentioned very clearly here was that the dominant youth literature of the mid to late 19th century was not this magazine. That was sort of, you know, the moms and dads taking over and saying, well, you can't read that crap anymore. What that crap was in Victorian England, they were called penny dreadfuls. Over here, they were sometimes called dime novels. And what they were these really lurid, violent, you know, kind of bits of fiction. You know, they were like short stories or novels mostly about, you know, desperados and gunslingers and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And this was, you know, those young Americans, mostly young American boys who were literate, were soaking this stuff up. You know, I mean, they were like the heavy metal of their day, right? I don't know what would happen if you read them backwards. You know, maybe you'd become Satan. But the idea was that we had to push against that. So just as the Anglo-African magazine was concerned with pushing against the abuse of alcohol and also domestic abuse and things like that, publications like this were pushing against what they argued was this literary decadence of, you know, these cheap fictions that aggrandized, you know, the anti-hero and violence and, you know, foul play and all this kind of stuff. Okay, that's been a constant struggle in the United States. It's still with us. It really is. So that was what was going on. And part of the notion of the Pledge of Allegiance kind of stuff and of patriotism was, remember, think Spanish-American War. This is when it's clear to the elites of America that the United States is recalibrating its political economy for empire, that's going to require a strenuous effort on behalf of, education, literature, journalism, to really unify and inspire the sense of American purpose. Okay, you're hearing that right now with respect to January 6th. You're hearing extraordinary hypocrisy coming from a lot of nominally mainstream, particularly television media, talking now about, insurrection and violence and all this kind of stuff in kind of cynical ways and sounding very reactionary. Okay, so that notion of the national purpose being a part of all this is, I think, if there's a common denominator in all of these articles, it's somehow that sense of either promulgating, or I would argue, particularly in the case of women reading, writing, and reshaping sexuality, pushing against a unified notion of national purpose and national identity, and claiming rather, a more authentic, localized and personalized identity. That's been a constant struggle in the United States. And, all these different forms of journalism and media in general have been instrumentalized either to push toward the unified, almost sometimes robotic notion of national purpose and, sort of Anglo-American superiority and all this kind of stuff, or to push against it. Okay, so the point there being, you can't separate media from politics in this sense. That as a driver of people's passions, as a unifier of their sense of purpose and all this, media have always been there. They've always been there, particularly in the period of time, beginning with the industrialization of the United States, which creates mass media. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, any more questions about this? I think that was pretty well covered, but was there any other questions? Yeah, Dylan.
So when I was reading the article, there was one thing that kind of like caught my attention, and that was that these periodicals sort of glossed over the like root causes of the Civil War in order to just like focus on patriotism and like pro-veteran rhetoric. And I was just curious, I mean, obviously you had veterans from both sides of the Civil War that were still alive at that point in time. Did they share that sentiment? Was that like widespread, that it was kind of like, oh, we should all just come together because we had shared experiences? Or was there still in between those?
No, it was not shared at all. It was an attempt to reassert a hegemonic nationality and national identity. And that hegemonic national identity was coming out of Reconstruction. So no, that's a very good point, though, historically, to remember that. I mean, the dynamics of this are still being played out right now. Okay. The Republican Party has had to embrace a lot of the legacy of the Southern legacy of the Civil War in trying to reformulate something it's never managed since the 1920s, a popular majority. Democrats abandoned the white South largely with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Those people, it took them within a generation to be more or less absorbed into the right wing of the Republican Party, and now the absolute base of the Republican Party. And so you're hearing, like you heard Lindsey Graham, I think it was, saying, well, if you impeach a president, if you impeach Donald Trump right now after he's left office, you might as well go back and impeach George Washington, retroactively, right? Because he owned slaves. And I'm standing here, right, making some eggs, killing my arteries for patriotic causes. And I'm yelling, but Lindsey, it wasn't a crime. But it's that idea of that fractured narrative. Yes, part of the challenge here is, I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't want to harp on it, is we're still reunifying from the Civil War. That took, you can argue we never really successfully have done that. I think a plausible case can be made that there are parts, particularly south of the old Mason-Dixon line, where people don't acknowledge the legitimate victory of the North. Why else carry Confederate flags? There's no other use for that banner, especially the Confederate battle flag. Okay. And again, it's not to moralize or demonize. It's just to say that, one of the reasons for these publications like the ones we've talked about is national identity is not organic and natural. It has to be created and sustained. It has to be. Not only in the United States, but everywhere in the world. I'm sorry, Julian, do you have your hand up? Sorry, I like left you on hold, didn't I?
No, that's okay. I just wanted to mention to that point, there was a specific quote in the essay that we read that said the magazine suggested, quote, whether it comes next year or 10 years hence, it is certain that by and by, the gallantry of the soldiers on both sides will be deemed the common heritage of all. And what you were saying just then about it being intentional, like that's, they knew what they were doing and trying to like reconfigure the memory of the war.
Yeah, trying to find heroes, you know, is a big part of the American myth that we're all heroes. You know, look at how often we toss that word hero out, you know. I mean, you know, a doctor gives me a shot and all of a sudden she's a hero. No, I mean, you're a doctor, that's nice, but you're not a hero. You know, now you give me that while someone's shooting over our heads, that's heroic. You know, I mean, I think I knew 2 guys who were medics in Vietnam. Yeah, I think that's heroic. Sorry. I think that's legitimate heroism. But, you know, it's that constant search for national identity by lionizing certain idealized characteristics or traits and saying that's the thing to which we all, right, to which we all aspire, whether or not we all do. National identity is a fabrication, not just in the United States, but everywhere. It is not organic. Okay. I mean, in the sense of nation state, right? And that's why we have subcultures, which will become increasingly apparent when we advance in our study of media in the next few modules. All right. Yeah, this is good. Anything else? Or can we go on to our travel to tourism? Are we ready to do that? Okay.
I'm ready.
Who wants to go first? Valeria, do you want
I
to
don't
go?
have a preference, but
Okay, fire away. You're speaking, so
Sure.
we get to go.
okay. So just an introduction. They start with talking about how photography was invented in 1839, and they talk about how the inventor Balzac, he felt that photography diminished the essence of what was being photographed, and I thought that was interesting. He didn't want to get photographed himself. Anyway, so moving on, photography was rapidly integrated into American culture.
All right, I'm sorry, I have
Sorry,
to
what?
interrupt you. I
Yeah,
think
sorry.
if you're going to mention that, it begs the question, what's the purpose of putting that in that article? Why did the author consider that to be important? Because there is an interesting theme there that is argued to carry through all of this. Do you remember?
Yeah, well, I think it touches on how photography changed the culture, how it changed social interaction with people, and even just the understanding of the world, how people perceived the world through photography became established in our culture. So, and it touches more on that later in the article. So I think that's why the author introduced that in the beginning.
Also, I would suggest, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but then I'll let you go. It's the idea that when technologies affect us, they can enhance certain parts of our world, but it's always at a cost. And remember, the initial fear of photography for many people was it's taking something out of us, taking that what
Right.
can't be replaced. So sorry, I'll let you go ahead, please.
No, exactly. That was a good point. So anyway, so the creation of photography kind of took a boom, and from the period of 1850 to 1900, there was also at the same time an expansion of transportation and travel. So expanded railway systems and more frequent steamboat crossings across the Atlantic. So those hand in hand, they kind of had a correlation with each other. They were both increasing at the same time, and that transformed the idea that American people had about tourism or travel, and it became tourism. It became something that people would go for pleasure and recreation instead of education or experiencing the culture, which was mainly what people traveled beforehand, is what the article discusses.
Okay, can I
So
ask?
yeah,
Can we put that on pause, because we want to make sure that your colleague
okay.
has something else to talk about. So the first important point then you would argue was that photography is an important part of the transformation of culture, right? Is that right?
Yes.
And that it relates to the way that we think about travel. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The purpose of travel changed.
Right. Okay. Now that's important. The purpose of travel changes. Well, Krista, do you want to pick that up from there? Is that a comfortable place for you to pick up the thread?
Sure, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, so sort of on that topic, like basically for a while there, travel was considered something that was for education and for gaining knowledge of either your own strengths and weaknesses, or things that you could use to better your own society with. And it was travel was considered fun, but the fun really came from knowing that you were learning and that you could be doing good with it. And then it talks about with after photography became really common, it turned more into this idea of tourism, which was more of like just going places to go places, and it wasn't as difficult as travel had been previously because Valeria was saying, there's more like opportunities for travel and things like that. And then the article sort of goes into a couple of different principles from some different it seems to be like well-known authors in this sort of field about how the changes in photography might have changed how we like see and perceive and come to know our world, basically. And it talks about how photography makes everything feel very similar because it pulls things out of context, and it can potentially turn. One of the phrases that they used that I thought was really like compelling was that it turns subjects into objects, because the people and the places that are experienced in travel, when they're photographed, then become these objects that can then be sold and commercialized. And it also creates this sense of always being in public. And the article argues that people became more like aware of their image and how they would appear in a photograph after photography became popular. And it also talks about how like photography preserves moments in time. And so like it captures a moment and gives us sort of this power over the way that time progresses. And the other like big thing it talks about is that it made people into spectators rather than participants, because the camera as an object sort of comes between the person and what they're experiencing, and it encourages them to just watch rather than participate in things, and that they're always sort of on the outside. So.
From either of you, I mean, that's pretty comprehensive. Were there any other additional points? Because I know I sort of interrupted the initial flow there. Anything else that you wanted to bring to bear on that? That's a good summary, I think. Okay, are there questions or comments about that? I mean, this is a classic example of how technology can intrude upon the personal experience of the world. You know, we find that, of course, much later with.
I want to add one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to. But while it was still in my mind, I wanted to add on one of the principles about how taking a photograph and then it becomes mass produced, and that mass. I think what I got from it is that the presence of photography kind of facilitated in the culture of mass production, and how it was more about people focused more on quantity over the quality, or catering to individuals' interest. It was more of just like a generalized, here's what you like, that's what you get. So
yeah, that's really important, because it's about, you know, one of the things that's emerging in sort of counter-capitalist intellectual critique at this time that becomes important with this is this idea of commodification, of the reification of making of human beings into things, or of ideas into things, but also of commodifying everything. That everything becomes, its only value is as a commodity. And often in, sort of the neo-Marxist critique at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, they would almost always look to the United States and say, both the great power of that political culture and its political economy, and the great danger of it is its ability to commodify everything and to declare of value only those things that have value as commodity. And I think, Valeria, I think that's the political implication of what you're talking about, that it can really subsume the value of authenticity and experience, because you can't monetize it. You can't, if you can't monetize it, it ceases to function as something of value. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that it used to be, for example, that what are now professional sports were not considered to be terribly valuable. They were just light entertainments and they were fun because they hadn't yet been successfully monetized. Now they're multi-billion-dollar enterprises. And they're so valuable to us that we will risk, the health of the athletes and their families and everything else, not only with respect to COVID, but particularly with what we know about football, but also as a boxing fan, I have to admit, we would watch those things and value them as symbolic and emblematic of virtue and all these kinds of things, notwithstanding the fact that the body count's getting pretty high, particularly in football, much more so, by the way, than boxing. So that notion of commodification that Valeria points out, that's very important as a kind of predicate of the critique of American political economy is, look, man, the only things that have value here are the things we can commodify. It's an extreme view, but it's relevant. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a good thing to think about when you're trying to make sense of American political culture and American political economy. Okay. All right. I can't believe it. Anything else? I think we're done. Well, what do you think, just in general? How do you think your colleagues did? How do you think the summaries went? Did you find them informative? Did they help you in terms of your grasp of the readings? That's the most important thing. Generally good, bad?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. Well, I have to say that almost without exception, if without exception, I think the presentations, if you're wondering, well, what should this thing sound like? That's what it should sound like. I thought that, these were some of the best presentations, some of the most well-organized and informative presentations I've had in this media class since I moved increasingly to this format. And I think it worked quite well. I hope that I didn't annoy you when I interrupted. It's just that part of me is thinking, gee, I have to kind of make sure that, this is, you made a great point, but then you moved on because you had the thing written out and all that. Sometimes we have to stop and sort of let something marinate a little bit and then move on. And that's the only thing I'm trying to do. I don't think there was a single time where I stopped you and said, oh no, you're just absolutely wrong. I made a mistake by misreading a point that Renee was trying to make. But other than that, no, it's not about being wrong. It's like, wait a minute, let's go back and revisit that and make sure we understand why that's so crucial to our understanding of these phenomena, particularly the intersections of technology, perception, culture, politics. It's all about what we perceive. Reality doesn't matter. Only thing that matters is the visibility and perception and interpretation of those phenomena that we consider to be real. And I think, we'll see that recurring in our subsequent, summaries and things. But I thought this went quite well. I'm really happy for the work that was done. Do you see though why in the modules that you prepare these things, it's not fair to ask you to write? I mean, you could, but you sort of exhausted yourself on it by then. But I think enough work has gone into them that I can justify. I made notes and everything, so there will be point values commensurate to what you actually having submitted written material. All right, then what I'd like to do is when we meet next Thursday, I'm going to give you, and again, there is a little audio recording for an overview of each of the modules. I'm going to try and create a little bit of, all we're going to be doing next Thursday is create a little contextualization, and then we'll do what we did last week. I want you to be thinking about, as you skim through the readings, think about whether or not you're ready to do a presentation. Keep in mind, you have to do 2 of them, okay? Unless you and I make a specific arrangement for some extenuating reason. So skim through the articles for module 2. There are, I believe, 7 of them. And see which one jumps out at you that you'd be willing to do a presentation with somebody else on. And then, so next week we'll do a little bit of an overview. We'll set up, who's going to be summarizing what. And then in the following Thursday, we'll actually do the presentations. And remember, if we don't get them all done, we just carry on into the next module and nobody gets hurt, All right. All right. Any questions?
Can I hang back and just talk to you for like 1 minute before you?
Yes, you can. But I got to remember not to put the end button on here. I'm just going to take my hand off my mouse. Okay. Again, I would say congratulations. You should all feel pretty accomplished at having done something that isn't very easy for a lot of us. I think it went quite well, and I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them all. Thank you.
I was just wondering, when is the homework for the paper due on the?
Okay, I'm going to make that visible right now. Okay. The due date on that, I want to say, is the well, you know what? I better hold on. Sorry, I have completely frozen here. 1 second. I don't know what's going on with my computer. Sorry. Yeah, it's Sunday the 24th.
Okay, perfect.
So you've got time. I want you to be able to take some time to do that. But as long as I have you here right now, so that you'll know, you will be my witnesses. I am now making that visible. I want to remind you too that you do need to do those notes. Okay.
And you also talked about maybe sending in rough drafts of our papers before we fully submit the full one.
Yeah, the best way to do that is if you could send me sort of an outline that's led by topic sentences or something, so I can see where.
Okay, and we could just email that to you, or
just email it to me. Yeah, you don't have to, but if you want to, then I would say that's fine. The earlier you do that, the better. But obviously, we've got a little bit of time. In fact, you've got 10 days. So that should be, I want quality writing. So that means I don't want a first draft. I want your best draft. Okay. And if that means you run something by me, then that's fine. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So the writing assignment should now be visible. I don't know if any of you have the access to the Moodle page. It should be visible. Is anybody looking at it?
Yeah, it's up there. I just saw it.
Okay. Yeah. So that's set. Okay, then enjoy your weekend. I'm going to stick around, I guess. I think, Dylan, you wanted to talk a bit? Okay.
Yeah, it's not anything that needs to be private or anything. I just didn't want you to end the meeting right away. So during our class time tomorrow, I have a board of trustees, not tomorrow, Thursday, next Thursday, I have a board of trustees meeting, so I won't be here. I'll hopefully be able to catch the tail end of class. So I was just wondering if I can put my name in for one of the articles now.
Yes. 1 second, because a couple of people have already done that, have gotten ahead of me, but let me.
Are you for real? Because I picked the one that I wanted last week and was I'm not going to be annoying and throw my name into the hat early on.
No, that's fine. Let me just stop the